Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. In this episode, I had the chance to once again have a conversation with Jonathan Rauch, one of my favorite intellectuals. And I say that interestingly enough because Jonathan is a journalist, and although he also has a position as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. But he is one of the deeper thinkers about social issues and science. And we had a lovely podcast discussion a while ago when his book, The Constitution of Knowledge, came out, talking basically about how knowledge is generated, and it provided some of the most cogent observations about what science is as a social activity of anything I've ever read. And it was based on sociology and philosophy and science. One of his early books was The Kindly Inquisitors, which was one of the first books to point out the attacks that are happening due to political correctness on science, which at the time he discussed it weren't very big, but now, of course, have become a big issue. Well, he has a new book out called Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And it was an interesting discussion because while we agree, we both come from similar places. We're both atheists and happen to have a Jewish background, and what Jonathan basically says is that democracy is broken in many places, and especially in the United States, and that Christianity, he argues, is broken as well. And he argues that one needs to fix Christianity to help democracy, and that's probably that's a statement I don't disagree with. But where we had differences of opinion was the level at which one basically felt Christianity was an essential part of our moral fabric in the country, and whether it needed to be, and the extent to which one should respect religious claims and traditions. It was a wonderful back and forth discussion. I felt, for me, and I think Jonathan agreed. And I would not have pressed him so hard if I didn't admire him so much as an intellect. I hope you'll find this conversation as fascinating as I did. And Jonathan, the remarkable thinker and cogent speaker that I find him to be. You can watch this podcast ad-free on our Substack site, Critical Mass, and you can do that by subscribing to Critical Mass, and the subscription fees go in large part to supporting the Origins Project Foundation, which produces this podcast. Or you can watch it on our YouTube channel and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can listen to it on any standard podcast listening site. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I hope you enjoy this podcast with Jonathan Rauch. Well, Jonathan Rauch, I'm so happy to have you back again. It's the second time I've had you on, and I will say that the reason we're having you on, I might as well show it now, is from your new book, Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, which I'm happy to have a discussion about, and it will be quite a discussion. And I want to, before I go on to dispute some comments or conclusions, or at least question them, I want to say that for me, this was an interesting book to read because I couldn't wait for it. Because I will say, from having listened to you speak and certainly read you, especially in advance of our last podcast, that I really mean this. I think you are perhaps the deepest and most articulate thinker on issues, social issues, scientific issues, and philosophical questions of anyone I've ever talked to. I'm amazed by your intellect. Let me just say that at the beginning.
That is an incredible compliment.
It is,
Thank
but
you.
it's deserved.
I will give myself that I am reasonably smart for a journalist, but I operate at the top of my license. Yes, it's a very low bar. That's all I give myself.
Yeah, good. Well, I think it's and I say this because if I didn't respect you so much, I would have had a hard time reading some of the book, because I disagree with numbers or at least I have a hard time. Well, we'll get to it. We dove into your background last time, so I don't want to. We don't need to do that as much. At the Origins, podcast, I try to find out how people got to where they are, and maybe the only origins aspect I'll do, which I was going to talk about later, but I'll throw now, is you begin the book with a little bit of an origin. You have a letter that you wrote to a friend, called The Dumbest Thing I Ever Wrote. First, I thought when I read the letter, I thought, is that letter the dumbest thing, or is it that you're talking about the dumbest things? So you want to talk about, presumably that motivated you to write this book. So do you want to talk about that for a second? At least it's an origin story.
Yeah, sure. Well, it frames a whole book, so it might take more than a
Yeah.
second. Is that all right?
Yeah. Sure. We'll go
So
wherever you
you
want
and
to
I
go.
are roughly the same generation. I was born in 1960. I knew from very early on that I could not believe in God. It seemed silly. It made no sense to me. Even as a child, and then as I got older, I tried at one point, and I'm Jewish. You can be Jewish and not believe in God if if you're not too noisy
Most
about
Jews
it.
I know are. I'm of Jewish
But
background too.
so I was raised as a Jew. I identify as a Jew, but I don't believe in God, and I tried at 14, and I just couldn't. It just seemed too far fetched and weird, and frankly, immature. And I was gay. I didn't recognize that in myself until I was 25. But from my earliest memories, I felt this strong, intractable attraction to boys and men. And between being Jewish and atheistic and knowing I was different in that profound way, I understood that there was no place for me in our Christian religious culture. I could not, I literally on a Sunday could not turn on the car radio and spin the AM dial without hearing a preacher talk about how I was a stench in God's nostrils, or gay people were in any case. So when I arrived in college, I had a really bad attitude toward Christianity. I believed that it was bigoted and cruel and hypocritical, and I was not wrong. And by the way, I am still not wrong. There are elements of all of those things right now, and I'm confident that that we'll get to some of those.
Yeah, we will.
But as luck would have it, one of my roommates my first year in college was Mark McIntosh, and he was my first encounter with a Christian who didn't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. Of course, he was human, so he had a temper and he had a sense of humor and could be weird and dorky. But he had been deeply shaped by his Christianity, by his readings in C.S. Lewis. And I saw in him a depth of belief and the way it had shaped him as a person and shaped the way he dealt with others that gave me the first inkling. Maybe there's a kind of Christianity that I haven't really been exposed to yet. My my life continued, and uh, I that began a journey, but not really into Christianity until much later. And in 2003, that's when I wrote what I call the dumbest thing I ever wrote. That takes some doing because in 2015, I confidently predicted Donald Trump would never be president.
Mm-hmm. We
But
weren't
in
alone there.
2003, I wrote an article for The Atlantic on what I called
Mhm.
apatheism, which, a joke combines apathy and theism.
It's
And
why
I
I
said,
define myself.
isn't it great? America's secularizing. We're just not that interested in religion anymore. And since religion is a source of divisiveness and dogmatism, we'll all get along better. We'll be like Scandinavia and we'll be Enlightenment liberals like me. It wasn't quite that bad, but that was kind of the tenor of it. And that turned out to be the dumbest thing I ever wrote. So this book is kind of an apology to Mark McIntosh, also for, some of the really annoying things that I said to him back when we were roommates.
Well, actually, it's interesting because before this we were talking. I will, as an aside, I will say that's one of the reasons to go to college. Lately, I'm hard pressed sometimes to think of reasons to tell people to go to college, given the way universities have been evolving. But one of the reasons, in principle, is to be exposed to people who are really different than yourself, different backgrounds, diversity of opinion, especially. And I think that's really one of the most important things you get out of college is seeing, in high school, if you go to public high school, even not, you tend to be surrounded by people with a very similar background, and hopefully, if you go to university, you'll meet people of very different backgrounds, and that can be perhaps the most important thing that you get out of university is your peers, and ultimately. Anyway, having said that, okay, that so this book in some sense is written as an apology, and I thought, and it is an apology, although I think you doth my own feeling is you doth protest too much, and um, it throughout the book, I have to say that I kept saying, I understand what you're saying, but I'm trying to figure out why you're saying it. It took me a while, and I think I did, and I'd like to go into that. But the basic premise of the book, I think, and we don't have to debate this at great length. We can tell me if you think it summarizes the reason, because there's a number of things that I think summarize it. Is that Christianity is broken in the U.S. and it's hurting democracy, and the solution is to in some sense be for Christians to be more Christian, and for the rest of us to integrate Christianity more healthily into political discourse. Is that kind of a
That's
reason?
good. That's it.
Okay, I get a passing grade at least for that. Okay.
Not bad.
Yeah, yeah,
Not
okay,
bad for a
thank
physicist.
for a physicist, exactly. The
There's
fact that
no
I can
math in the book, you know.
yeah, that's right. That I can read those big words is just amazing. But anyway,
Yeah.
but, and so I kept saying, "Well, okay, great, but why do we need to accept Christianity or integrate it? Why do we need to be more Christian, and why do we care that Christianity is broken?" The chapters are divided into thin Christianity, where you talk about the dangerous situation that Christianity's in, and then sharp Christianity, where you say basically one of the reactions to Christianity is the church of fear, the Donald Trump version of Christianity, and then thick Christianity, which is the gospel of compassion and compromise, and 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 that's a fascinating chapter. And I want to. It was really the last chapter that put together for me where I thought you were coming from. So a lot of my questions are going to relate to statements you make there, referring back to other arguments. Just so you know where we're going to go. Um, the other um, the other version of the summary of your book that I have is it takes off a statement you made in that chapter, which is, and I'll frame it as a statement rather than a question, but how an atheistic homosexual Jew thinks Christians should practice their faith.
Yes, that's my presumptuous summary.
Yeah, okay. And then I would add, because to make it a full summary, that's really only half a summary. The next question is why, and the answer is because it's essential for a healthy democracy in the United States. So we put those things together. An atheist Jew, homosexual Jew, tells Christians how to behave because it's essential for the healthy democracy. So that's my other summary. And I want to parse both parts because I have deep questions or concerns, although I'm sympathetic and I understand where you're coming from about why all of this is necessary. So I want to go through it in detail, and I wouldn't if I didn't. I'm serious. I wouldn't if I didn't respect you so much. Um,
I'm
okay.
looking forward to it. Could I just to clear some brush, could I just ask you flat out, are you an atheist?
Oh boy, Jonathan,
Oh,
that's
was that not?
wonderfully asked.
Oh, sorry. I thought that would be a yes or no.
Oh yes, of course. I guess it's nice. It means that you. Yeah, I'm kind of one of the. I sort of became known as an atheist. I'm actually an apatheist. I was for a while, an anti-theist with my friend Christopher Hitchens, um, but I've been labeled an atheist and one of the whatever. Uh, Although I never really classify myself as an atheist, because I don't classify myself by the things I don't believe. That would be too long. But the only ist I use is a scientist. But I'm well known. I'm definitely an atheist, and I'm of a Jewish background, and I
And
now
would it
call myself a Jew, although I didn't used to. I do only because there's so much anti-Semitism. I'm
Yeah, well,
heterosexual, but that's about it.
so we're coming from a very similar place. I would
Yeah.
also say I'm not a spiritual person. There are people like Sam Harris who talk about spiritualism or
Yeah.
spirituality of different kinds. I've never had that kind of experience, and I'm not especially interested in having one. Are you similar to me in that respect too?
I am even more so. I don't have the spiritual bone in my body. I don't know what it means. When people tell me they're spiritual, I ask. I have no, it's usually in a sort of a subterfuge, even saying spirituality. So yeah, no, I'm not a spiritual person. In any sense, I get awe and wonder, and that's why I do science. And I get awe and wonder when I look at James Webb Space Telescope photographs of the universe, and that's what causes me to do what I do. Um, but and I don't. My attitude towards meditation. I've spent time with Sam Harris, who I've argued with on numerous occasions about many things, but meditation is one of them. I'm reminded when I hear him talk about meditation of a Woody Allen joke, who said he started meditating, but then he ripened and then he started to rot.
Yeah. Well, good. That's helpful to me because it tells me that I am talking to myself a couple of decades ago. And that isn't to say I was wrong then. I see this as a continuation and outgrowth, a superstructure built on the former me. But this will be interesting.
That's, what, you anticipated me, because what I was about to say, this is where I was originally going to insert your dumbest letter you ever wrote, and I'm going to say, I'm the dumb you. Okay, that's how I was gonna. That's how I was. So that's what I've written down here. That's where we're beginning. I'm the you in either the time of your university education or in 2003. Um, um, Although in 2003, I didn't think I guess I wasn't as. I didn't think we were as a nation becoming less religious, because I've been fighting that against people who wanted to remove evolution in the public schools for years and years, and so that part of it was still clear to me. Anyway, okay, so you summarize in your last chapter of your book. What I liked about it is you put it in perspective what you're trying to. I should say the first part of the last chapter, and we'll get to it, deals with gives great respect to the absolutely nuttiest religion in existence, except for Scientology, the Church of Latter-day Saints, a religion that's built on not just on presumably false claims about the universe, but manifestly false claims about even its sacred books. And we can go into that, because I spent a lot of time looking into Mormonism. But it is a kindler, gentle. Even when I was a kid, I grew up in Canada, and I'd never heard of Mormonism, but I saw their commercials, and I thought, oh, they're just like a nice version of Anglicanism. They talk about don't beat your kids and be kind to others, and I thought it was that kind of religion until first time I went to Utah, and went to the Mormon Tabernacle. And then later on, when many ex-Mormon bishops, when I became known as an atheist, especially in Australia, began to reveal to me lots of things about the Mormon Church. But anyway, the first part of that chapter is actually a discussion of how they, at least the head of that church, is espousing the kind of Christianity that you not only think is possible, but think could help cure the ails of Christianity and democracy in our nation. But we'll get to Mormonism later, because I'm not sure it's as important for me to talk about Mormonism, although I'm happy to later. It's the ideas behind it that you espouse. So then in the second part, you talk about really summarizing where you've been. And I think that summary is so good and allows us to summarize the rest of the book. The first part is that American Christianity is in crisis. You say it's thinned, it's secularized, and it's not providing meaning and moral grounding as it once was. And this is an important statement. Secular alternatives like science cannot even in principle fill the void. So you want to elaborate on how on that part of the book and the crisis in Christianity, if you will.
Yes, there's a lot to cover there.
There is, but I want you to cover it.
Okay. All right. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is empirical and sociological. And then the second thing I'm going to say, which is where I may run into more trouble with you, but I'll be interested to see, is epistemological and existential. So the first part is empirical and sociological, which is in 2003, when I celebrated secularization, I thought that the alternative would be liberal post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment thinking, and we'd all be like Steve Pinker. Yeah. Or more like Steve Pinker.
Yeah.
Empirically, I was wrong.
Absolutely.
In 2003, as I wrote that article, the country embarked on a de-churching of a magnitude that this country has never experienced before. We used to say America remained a uniquely religious nation while other nations of Europe had secularized. Well, it turned out we were just late to the party, but when we got to the party, boy, did we get to the party. So we have seen 40 million people go from church attenders to never setting foot in a church over 14 years. Until 2022, we have seen church membership, which was 70%, 70, right through the 20th century, dropped to 47%, under half, just in the last 2 decades. We've seen a percentage point drop every year in the percentage of people identifying as Christian, and they're becoming nones, N-O-N-E-S, people not affiliated with religion. And the empirical effect of that has been they don't seem to be going in the direction that you and I thought they might go. They seem to be adopting substitute pseudo-religions of all kinds. There are DIY religions. They're not really religions, but they have some of the structure.
Yeah.
And you've got the wellness movement and Soul Cycle, and you've got Wicca and stuff like that. But a lot of it is that they are reifying or deifying religion. They're turning partisan politics into a kind of religion. So we see wokeness on the left. I think John McWhorter, probably had him on the show, talks about woke as a religion. It's not a standard traditional religion, but it has a lot of the same structure.
Except for forgiveness, it has all of the same structure.
Yeah. And then MAGA and QAnon and the stuff that's going on the right. Christian nationalism, of course, which is not Christian at all. It's a political ideology. These also have many of the attributes of religion. And just generally, people were turning to politics to get a sense of identity, and then they were bringing religious zeal into politics, and that's making us ungovernable. So it turns out, as flawed as Christianity was, it was still capable of transmitting communal values, giving people a sense of higher purpose in life, a sense of grounding for their morality, a way to socialize with each other, to socialize their kids into civic life. And these other things are just not capable of doing that. And this is a global crisis. Okay, that's the sociological and empirical explanation. I will pause for breath.
Yeah, pause for breath and pause for me for a mild attack. No, for mild questioning. Certainly, it was obvious, not in the U.S. and in England, that the number of people calling themselves Christian was going down. A cause for celebration among much of the atheist community, and there's an interesting survey that was done by the Richard Dawkins Foundation in England around that time, a little bit later, about 2010, I think, maybe 11. People asked religious affiliation on the census in England, and for the very first time in the history of the census, less than 50% of the people declared they were Christian, and that was a big deal. The Dawkins Foundation then went. I don't know how they did this, but they got people who declared themselves. Maybe they just made phone calls and asked, "Did you declare yourself as Christian?" And they asked the people who declared themselves as Christian why they declared themselves as Christian. And they said, "Do you believe in transubstantiation? Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in this, that?" In every case, the answer was no, 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 no. And then they said, "Well, why did you call yourself Christian?" They said, "I like to think of myself as a good person." And therein goes, in my mind, one of the problems of this moral grounding that you talk about, because it hadn't really hit me. I'd fought religious extremism when I first started to get involved in becoming sort of relatively high public profile. But when we produced a movie called The Unbelievers about me and Richard Dawkins, I got letters from people from small towns around the United States saying, I was so amazed because one of the scenes in it is the Reason Rally, where he had 40,000 people in Washington, proclaiming atheism. And I said, wow, I had never realized. I always felt alone. and I've questioned whether God might exist, and I feel like a bad person for doing that. And I know if I told anyone around me, I would alienate them and be called a bad person. So religion had this monopoly on morality when it's not clear it should. It does provide moral grounding, but why does one have to? For many people, it provides moral grounding, but I don't know whether one should accept a priori that that moral grounding is good or justified. In the first place, if you base it on fairy tales, you're probably going to come up with nonsense. But secondly, much of the moral grounding, as you point out, is bad moral grounding. And in particular, the the sense that questioning God takes you in the wrong direction is the kind of moral grounding that I think is the most insidious and perhaps the most evil aspect of religion, even though it has many other evil aspects. So I throw that out to you.
Well, first of all, the best believers I know are non-dogmatic. Mark McIntosh was one of those. He went on to become the Reverend Dr. Professor Mark McIntosh, wrote many books, but they will all tell you that doubt is very much a part of their faith. So they reject the kind of dogmatism you mentioned. Second, look, Lawrence, I'm gay, right? The oppression, and I do mean oppression, that was loosed upon people like me for 60 years, ending only really as recently as 2010, 2011, when we were finally allowed to serve in the military and get married, 2015. This was done out of religious bigotry based on a reading of scripture. So believe me, I don't need to be persuaded that the influence of religion can be ignorant and blind and cruel and hypocritical. Let's just stipulate that. However, as we get into the discussion, something that I now insist on, which I think my younger self missed, is that you can't treat any religion, or certainly you can't treat Christianity just as an empty vessel for sociology or politics or economic status. It has substantive content. There are scriptures and there are things that Jesus said, and those are moral propositions which can be evaluated on their own terms. And as I argue in the book, those propositions, many of them, core ones to Christianity, align with things that are true and important in a liberal democracy. So
Okay.
it's not just that I'm saying, be religious, it'll make you a better person. I'm saying, look at the doctrines of Christianity. There's something valuable.
Yeah, okay. Some of the doctrines. That's the point. And it's what most religious people do. They pick and choose the doctrines. That's why, Christianity and Judaism become sort of kindler, gentler, as opposed to Islam, which is 600 years earlier. In Islam, they take all the nonsense of the Quran literally. Most Christians who read the Old Testament and New Testament throw out all the stuff about stoning your children and all that kind of stuff if they disobey. They pick the doctrines of Jesus, by the way, who at least I learned from my late friend Christopher Hitchens, talked about hell more than anyone else in the Bible. Pick the kind and gentle Jesus, and the kind and gentle aspects of Christianity, and why do they do that? Because it aligns with, I think, their moral framework. And you talk in the book, and I know we've talked about it before, and I will get to it, Kant and Adam Smith, and how there's this alignment between certain of the statements you like, in particular by the president of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and the statements made by Kant and Adam Smith. But those statements are based on reason and logic, and so they don't necessarily derive from religion. So the fact that, I guess my statement is, it is true. There's no doubt that Christianity, and I have a number of born again friends who are lovely people, and they're kind and gentle and giving and generous and all the things that your friend was. But I also have friends who aren't religious who are all of those things. But but I don't see, so the fact that that some of the better angels of the moral nature of the Bible happens to coincide with the kind of things that a sensible, reasonable, rational altruistic person might come to without religion. The fact that they agree, I say, okay, big deal. That's nice. But why do we have to turn to that? Why can't we just say that it's reason? In fact, again, I'm jumping ahead, but you often quote, and I was very impressed with the statements of the president of the Church of Latter-day Saints. But one of the things that struck me about him is that he's a lawyer as well, right? And I ask myself, when he starts talking about the civic aspect of religion, which is very sensible, and we'll get to, I mean, how religion can play a role in the civic world. It sounded to me like he was talking like a lawyer or a founder, a founding father of like the people like Jefferson or those people who were using those arguments based on what you might call the Enlightenment and not so much Christianity. So I throw that out to you.
Well, there are a couple of directions we can go there. One is to the deeper, more existential reason why I think secularism and Christianity need each other, and I know
Agreed.
you'll disagree about that.
I may not,
Another
but
direction,
that's
though,
why I
we
like.
should go is that everything you just said is too vague. It's not
Okay.
a question of picking out good stuff and bad stuff and nice stuff and not so nice stuff. It's a question of here are what Christians say are three core tenets of their faith. And it's there in the scripture. And it turns out, I argue, those things map well onto Madisonian democracy. And
Yes.
I don't care whether John Locke and Immanuel Kant got that from Christianity or from reading books. Doesn't matter. The point is that the points of similarity are there and they're deep and they're fundamental, and that gives us something to work with if we think it's important to elevate those parts of Christianity, still the linchpin faith of America, that align with liberal democracy. Because right now, Christianity and liberal democracy are out of alignment and getting further out of alignment, and it's tearing us apart. It's making us ungovernable. Okay, so now
Look,
do you
I
want
think
the existential
no.
stuff
Let's comment on
or
that
do you
because I
want the
agree.
Christian stuff?
Yeah, but no. I'm not sure what I want. I agree with you. I think from a utilitarian perspective, this country is deeply Christian, and 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 they're deeply out of alignment, and it's hurting democracy. And so, if you're saying, if from a utilitarian perspective, if we can make Christianity better, then it's better for the country. I would not disagree with that at all. It certainly would be true. I think. What I guess, and maybe this leads to the existential question. So we agree on that. Um,
Yeah.
and
You said better. I would say more Christian, more truly Christian, but for our purposes, it's the same thing. Yes.
yeah. I mean, and the three things are don't have no fear. What were
Don't
the
be
three things?
afraid, imitate
Don't be.
Jesus, and forgive each other.
Yeah, imitate Jesus, forgive each other. Okay. Anyway, again, okay. Uh, Imitate Jesus is an interesting question, but we'll get. I don't want to turn this into a theological debate, but you do say this an interesting thing. Look, I also agree with you. I think we talked about this before. I've had this debate with my friend Martin Rees, who's a non-believing but very non-atheistic scientist, um, former president of the Royal Society and a famous astrophysicist. Um, you know, whether I agree with David Hume that you can't get aught from is, but you can just get so damn close. And without knowing what is, you can't get aught. And that's part of my problem with religion, because I think religion often bypasses what actually is, whether it's homosexuality or racism or other things, and to get an aught that's incorrect. Um, Religion will say homosexuality is, unnatural, and then a scientist will say, no, it's totally natural. If you look at lots of species, 10% of them have homosexual, and so I think you need that is to get the right aught, and I think religion by revelation rather than empiricism often gets the wrong aught because it takes things by revelation rather than looking at how the world actually works. But you do say secular alternatives like science cannot, even in principle, fill the void. And and in a sense, I agree because science can't always get you the odds. But I'm not sure I agree 100% with that. I also should say that I have written maybe more than you over the last 5 years at least, decrying repeating something you wrote in one of your early books that we talked about in the podcast, that this woke fundamentalism, which is what I call it, fundamentalist wokeism, I think is what I call it, is a secular religion and is dangerous in many ways, as dangerous as religious fundamentalism. And that aspect of secularism, which which tries to impose its ideology on everyone, including religious people, is evil. And it is true that as religion waned, we tended to see more people move in that direction of secular wokeism. But I don't think I agree with you that science cannot, even in principle, fill the void. In practice, it hasn't. But why do you think in principle it couldn't, is what I want to ask. And maybe that's the existential question.
I'm thinking about how to approach that. So, since you don't seem to mind excessively long answers, let me try to give my framework for how I think about
excessively
this.
long questions, so why wouldn't I mind excessively long answers? Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm a fan and listener of your podcast. I try never to miss one, and part of what I love about it is you and your guests are really willing to dive deep, and that's such a treat.
Thank you.
So, I claim in the book that there are 4 questions. There are other questions, but there are 4 questions which most people, not all people, but most people and most societies, in fact, virtually all societies and cultures look for answers for. And that 2 of those questions are things that really only science can provide in a coherent way. And that's the answer to why do evil and suffering occur? That's not even a problem in science, right? We deal with that by analyzing disease and why earthquakes and tsunamis happen. And the other is giving a coherent account of the material world. In order to do that, you must exclude miracles, and you don't need any lectures on David Hume and miracles and supernaturalism from me. And a purely religious framework gets tripped up by both of those things. Once you introduce miracles, you're in a world of chaos. Explanations aren't even possible anymore. And you're stuck with the question of why a good God would create evil. One of the great pastors of the 20th century, Tim Keller, the very, very searching and honest Christian, once told me that he took every argument that he had for why a good God would create evil or allow suffering of the innocent and so forth. And if he put them all in a bucket to answer that question, he could not get that bucket more than 2/3 or 3/4 of the way full. He just couldn't do it. And I think he's right. No religion has done that. But then there's these 2 other questions, and this is where maybe you and I part ways. One of those questions is the problem of mortality. Why are we here? Is there a purpose to life? Are we more than just a glob of protoplasm that forms briefly and then evanescently flashes out in the blink of an eye later, leaving no trace behind? Well, I think that's what we are. And strangely, I'm okay with that. I think I am, at least, but most people just aren't. It's just too existentially bleak. And I don't think, this goes to your is-odd question.
Yeah.
I don't think even in principle, scientific materialism, which is basically what I believe in, can tell us if or why there's a larger purpose in life, some reason that we're here. It's not designed to do that. It's not a factual question. So that's a big shortcoming. The second one is the one you alluded to, the question of morality. Difference between right and wrong, good and evil. Is that anchored in something larger and more stable than just our preferences? Or do we live in a Nietzschean postmodern world where it's just all what humans think and do? A lot of thinkers, you alluded to them. Kant is the greatest and very, very great. But lots of others, John Rawls in the liberal tradition, John Stuart Mill, Plato himself in a non-liberal tradition have wrestled with this question of, can you get out of non-religion, an anchored account, a transcendent account of good and evil. And I think when I take all the best arguments that I have, including Kant, who's, incredibly great, and Spinoza and all these people, and throw them in a bucket, it's still only 2/3 or 3/4 of the way full. Religions, that's what they do, right? They give us a sense of transcendent purpose, and they give us what they say are anchored answers to questions about morality. Now, as an atheist, I'm incapable of thinking that their answers are right. And I used to think their answers were just crutches. They just assume the answer. They assume God, and that answers the question. Well, then we're back where we started, because who created God? And so forth. You know all the atheistic arguments.
Mm-hmm.
The big change in me, which you're about to hear, is not spiritualism.
Mm-hmm.
It's something a little different. I began to get to know some people, like, for example, prominent example, Francis Collins.
Yeah, I know Francis.
You know Francis.
Mhm.
Francis is one of the greatest living scientists by most accounts. You're going,
Yeah, no, anyway, that doesn't matter.
He is a giant of modern American science, former head of the National Institute of Health, and
helped turn it into a
discoverer,
working computer,
co-discoverer of the genome, all of that. He's a Christian, and somehow he is capable of living in both of these worlds at once. He can be a believing Christian who actually believes. I asked him about this, Lawrence. I said, look, can't you believe in the truth of what Christ told us as moral principles without believing that he died, and then 3 days later somehow the second law of thermodynamics reversed itself and all the molecules reassembled themselves? Because from my point of view, that can't happen, right? If that happens, everything we know about the world is wrong, and you're out of a job. Physicists are unnecessary.
No, we'd study
And
it.
he said, if I did not believe that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, I would not be a Christian. I couldn't. It would be a lie. The whole thing would be a lie. And yet, he's capable of going to work every day and being a leading scientist, thinking as rationally and as systematically as you or I. And I got to know a whole lot of Christians to whom that label applied. So my attitude changed toward thinking that, these folks have the best of both worlds. They're able to partake of these spiritual and religious traditions and satisfy themselves of these big answers to these questions I can't answer, while also functioning perfectly well in my scientific materialist universe. And it's like they have full spectrum color and I'm colorblind.
No, well,
Because I can only do half of that, and I do feel like that's really my loss.
well, see, it's interesting that you feel it's a loss rather than a gain surprises me, because I think what they have, and I know friends as well, it is people have the ability, not just the ability, the requirement in order to get through life, the ability to believe at least 2, maybe 10 inconsistent things at the same time. We have to lie to ourselves when we get up in the morning that we like our job or our spouses or whatever, and we just invent these stories, and as Alice in Wonderland, we believe 10 impossible things at the same time. And so scientists, and I have a number of friends, some of whom are actually really great scientists, who are religious, and they manage to believe to as as the famous biologist who was also an atheist, one of the more famous biologists, at the 19th century or early 20th century, said, when I go in the laboratory, I become an atheist. I don't think God is turning the dials. And so if I'm an atheist when I'm in the laboratory, why am I an atheist when I'm outside the laboratory? I think it's because people want to believe, like Fox Mulder, and they can find a way to separate those two things effectively. And I mean, Francis had if you've read his book, I don't know if you ever had his weird conversion to Christianity by seeing a waterfall, still amazes me. But anyway, I think the question you're the you can't. It's hard. Science alone. Well, maybe science can answer why we have morality, but I think the morality that's provided, there's no evidence that fundamentally it comes from religion. I've often asked audiences, if you didn't believe in God, would you kill your neighbor? No. And only one time did I have someone put up and say yes. Okay. I think there are, and I had a conversation, which if you listen to the podcast, you might with someone with Nicholas Christakis, who you may know. Um, and this whole book we discussed, his book Blueprint, is that evolutionary psychology has ultimately, um, via evolution, led to societies that are fundamentally good. I mean, led people to be, because in the end, it doesn't work, more or less. Basically, we are hardwired to have functioning societies if we can, because those function well. And ultimately, there are, natural selection reasons why we have developed those rules. And some people could call that morality. So I think the question of why we believe what we believe may be addressable by science. Whether that's good or not in an absolute sense, I agree. I don't think so. I mean, that's science can answer.
That's the
But
problem right there, yes.
it may not be a problem. You say why, and the why question may just not be a good question. And so,
If Lawrence, if the world were made up of people, clones of you and me, I think that might be the case. Even I would, if I could find what I thought was a fully rational, plausible account that anchored my morality in something greater than myself, or some explanation, naturalistic explanation, which explains but doesn't justify, I would grab it. I don't think it's possible. But most people need something more than just, well, this was an evolutionary success, so we believe it.
yeah, oh yeah, you're right. But we try not. But that's just but is that not where we're on question 4 of 30? So it's interesting. But anyway, is that not just a statement that we're not doing a good job namely, we're not selling it like religious people sell it. I would claim that if on every Sunday, instead of having to repeat the same fairy tales to convince ourselves they're true, which actually, believe it or not, it was Hugh Downs. Do you remember Hugh Downs? Do you remember Hugh
Yeah, the
Downs?
game
You're
show
old enough.
host?
Yeah, but in fact, he wasn't just a pretty face. He was he was unbelievably intelligent. I met him when I moved to Arizona because he read some of my papers and called me, and we had conversations, and I was blown away by how intelligent that man was at age 93. But he was the first one who told me, he said he thought the reason they have church every Sunday is that you need to be reinforced because the stories are so silly that every week you have to go back and see other people buying him in order to reinforce your willingness to believe this stuff. But if we I think you can sell science as saying, look, science tells us that we're connected to all other human beings, that we have intimate connections, not just in our evolution, but in our atoms, that we exchange atoms, that I'm breathing in atoms from my deepest enemies every day, and we have a kind of common humanity. That also, the fact that we are just here for a brief instant should not dismay you, but should invigorate you to make the most of the time you're here. I mean, we could, and these are the arguments I use, but I think one could imagine selling a kind of, um, more, first I would argue more truthful, but secondly, I would argue somewhat satisfyingly, uh, accurate view of the world that might inspire people, and that science could inspire, and that religion often, just as often, divides. You said somewhere in the book, and again, I have it later on, but we'll see if we may not get to later on. So, um, that religion provides certainty in a world where secularism, is increasingly uncertain in many ways. But the point is, the world isn't certain, and providing certainty in a world that's uncertain I is not necessarily, I would think, a good guideline, and it's not obvious to me that, once again, I agree with you, we have done a crappy job. Science does not fill a void that religion fills, and religion clearly fills a void because every society that's ever existed has some religious basis. It's clearly an evolution fulfills an evolutionary need at some level. But the question I would at least ask in principle is it necessary that to fill that need, we have to do it with religion? And I don't know the answer, but I don't think the answer is obviously no. And you do, because you basically say, um, Christianity is a load-bearing wall, and its failure hurts democracy. Well, that's a property of the United States, I think. But once again, does it have to be? Can you the United States is a democracy that also is in a country that's heavily Christian, whatever you mean by the word.
Well,
But do you need it? I mean, Athens was one kind of democracy in a world that wasn't Christian. There are, the Nordic countries like Sweden and others may not be, or have democracies that are not. So it's empirically true that the United States relies on Christianity, but once again, is it absolutely necessary? It's sufficient, but is it necessary? That's the question I have.
I've lived in Japan and my first book was about Japan, and it is an example of a society which, although there's plenty of religion, the whole country is full of beautiful temples.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of religion that we think of when we think about Christianity or Judaism. It's not a big, all-encompassing theological kind of religion. It has more to do with ancestors. So yeah, it's possible to have a very well-ordered society without Christianity per se. I think it's much harder to do that without anything spiritual or transcendent at all. I think some small minority of people like you and me are pretty happy living in a world where we just don't have any of that stuff. And we look for we look to explanations, but we don't look to ultimate justifications. It's the nature of science, as you don't need me to know, that we don't believe in ultimate absolute certainties. We believe in steadily approaching truth, but we believe that truth is a direction that we set, and that any given moment, our understanding of that truth, objective reality, will have mistakes. I think most humans, I could be wrong, but I think as an empirical matter, most humans need something more than just, well, I think the Holocaust was bad, but I might be wrong.
Well, but no, but you say, okay, look, that's a cute way of putting it, but I dispute that. I mean, it's an extreme view that I don't think it proves the rule, namely that um it is, how can I put this? The I people seem to need, I agree with you. People seem to need these things. The question I have is, once again, is can you fulfill those needs otherwise? And I don't think. And by the way, I try not to use the word believe, and you used it at the same time. In science, we don't use the word believe. Things are likely or unlikely. And so I think what we can say as scientists is that everything we know about the universe and the world and human being and human history tells us the Holocaust was an abomination. And that, so I don't think we have to say, but maybe we're wrong. I mean, it's just like I could say, well, the sun may not rise tomorrow, but it's so unlikely that we basically say it's going to rise tomorrow. And and um and I and so I think and part of the problem is, yeah, I didn't really intend this to be a discussion of atheism, but part of the problem is, I'll give you the example that I think illustrates the problem that I first heard from Dawkins, by the way, where he presented a picture of a newspaper. It was a wonderful picture at Christmas time. It had a Jewish kid and a Christian kid and a Muslim kid and a Hindu kid together in a little room getting along together, and the statement was how wonderful it is. But he pointed out, how dare we call this 3-year-old a Muslim kid or a Jewish kid or a Hindu kid? These are deep and sophisticated issues of the existence of God. We impose that on that 2 or 3-year-old, and I would argue that part of the problem most people have dealing with it is that they were force-fed it when they were young, and it's very hard to overcome that that role, and that if we tried to satisfy kids and encourage them to think about the wonderful things about the world, but didn't feed them those things, maybe not. Maybe there'd be more people who didn't need that. It's a question, it's a question that I don't think I have the answer to, but I think it's not unlikely.
I suppose, maybe that experiment could be run somehow someday, but we're running that experiment for 20 years in the United States, and it's going very badly. All the social indicators on things like loneliness, mental health, isolation, anger at politics, deinstitutionalization, social trust, they're all falling off a cliff.
Yeah, no,
So,
but we're not. That's not the experiment we're giving them. We're filling them with ideology, not science. We're not asking for people to ask
and
questions, and and
and
and
and
also not asking for people to say, "I don't know the answer. I don't know. Let's work together to find it." We're telling people a different ideology, and we're feeding that. And I think that's is responsible for all of those indicators.
so So here's where I revert to that point I made earlier that in my mind is so important. We're not talking about generic feeding ideology.
Hmm.
We're talking about some specific principles of a specific religion, which, if elevated within that faith, would make our country stronger and better. I want to say those principles, and there is a name for those principles, and that name is Christianity. So I am making a specific argument about Christianity to Christians. There's another argument we can make about whether people who are raised in Taliban societies are force fed anti human arguments. I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But I don't have to have that conversation
Okay.
here.
Okay. Before we move on, you keep raising question mark. So you, I used to think that the thing I liked about Judaism, I still think the thing I like about Judaism, that at least the part of it that I got, and I grew up in a very secular Jewish household, so my Jewish theology is sorely lacking, I'm sure. But was the questioning from Fiddler on the Roof on, the idea that you can question God, and and um and to me that I keep thinking, hey, that would be a great, wouldn't that be a great religious basis for society? Forget Jesus. Just no one's not subject to question, and we can meet together and have good dialogues where we disagree, and it doesn't have to be on Friday night or whatever. And
It's
yeah,
Lawrence, the first thing I learned in my second rate, but still, I guess, deeply shaping Jewish education. The first thing I learned is Jews question everything. We even question God. We bargain with God. We question God. And to me, that's a foundation of Judaism, which carries over into the Enlightenment. And it is not a coincidence that so many of the people right now who are pushing back against the right wing political absolutism that we're seeing have been Jews. So this book is not about Judaism because Jews are 3% of the population,
right.
and we are not responsible for the rise of ungovernability in America. My book is
Okay, and
addressed primarily to white evangelical Protestants.
yeah,
But have
and I
I
mean,
sometimes thought the world should be Jewish? Maybe we'd be better off? Yeah, I'll confess to that.
okay, no, yeah, and your point is well taken, and that's and I don't want to lose that thread. That this is a book about the U.S. and it's a book about the world, the U.S. as it is, and what you think could help it, and what you think is now hurting it, which is broken Christianity. And one way we could help the U.S. is to unbreak Christianity. So I keep on coming back, but I can't help dealing with some of these other deeper questions. But yeah, but the last thing before we will move on. Your arguments in
We
that
are
sense.
moving on. This is moving on.
Yeah, good.
This
As
is
long as you don't
awesome. This
mind.
is
As
great.
long as you don't mind. I don't know what the listeners think, but as long as you don't mind,
You
they're gonna say,
never get
Lawrence.
past item 5 in your list
Yeah,
of 30. That's
I
why
know,
we
I know. I
love your
usually get back.
podcast.
I usually get back maybe to 7 anyway. But uh, the the other thing that occurred to me, because I understood you, this is kind of and I don't want to sound philosophical because I'm not, but kind of utilitarian view. Hey, look, what can make things better? Maybe not in the absolute reality, what can make the an ideal world better, but what can make the real world better? And I understand that, and I applaud that. But it reminded me, your turning to Christianity reminded me a little bit of my friend, Ayan Hirsi Ali, who you may or may not know, but she was a well-known atheist, and we appeared together at many atheist events, and she's still my friend. Um, she recently, as you may or may not know, announced she had convert to Christianity, and my friend Richard Dawkins had a real hard time with that. I wrote her a private letter, not a public letter, arguing why I think I understood it and I accepted it. But partly, I think, because she grew up she was brought up in in a religious Muslim household, and once again, I think if you lose that later on, you have a spiritual gap in your life that you want to fill. I think that's partly. But the other argument, which she gives explicitly, is kind of utilitarian. Islam is an evil for the world, and you can't fight it with secularism. You can only fight it with another religion, and the other religion is Christianity. That's basically her argument, is that it's almost a Crusades argument. It's the argument that we can't fight the claimed moral superiority of Islam with secular scientific arguments. We need to appeal to a God that's kind and just and blah, 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 whatever Christianity is. And that's why she became a Christian. And I guess I was kind of thinking that there's some overlap between her argument for becoming Christian and your argument for how to solve a failing democracy, since we rely on a God, and we might as well make the God we rely on a better one.
Oh, I wouldn't put it that way. But I see where you're going, and it's on the right track. So the only really good reason to believe a religion is because you think it's true, because that's really the only good reason to believe anything, right? Otherwise, you're insincere. And if someone says, well, I'm a Christian because it's probably good for society for me to think that, but no, I don't really think that Christ died on the cross or was resurrected. Okay, for them if they want to do that. But there's an element of, that's not something that I would ask or expect anyone to do. And I try not to be hypocritical about this. I don't pretend to be a believer because I'm not. I'm also trying really hard not to be one of those people in this book who says, well, I'm too smart to believe in God, but I'm glad those other dummies do because it makes society better off.
Yeah, no, you don't.
I really don't go there. And one reason is I do feel that I'm missing out on something, a part of life. It's like parenthood. I'm not a parent either, but a lot of people are. And they tell me it's a really deepening experience. And when my Christian friends or Jewish friends tell me that, I think that this is a hugely important part of their life and a deepening part. I accept that. So I think I'm the one missing out.
Oh,
but
see,
also,
sorry, go on.
I'll finish the thought. We can circle back, but
Yeah.
I'm headed toward the point you're making about Ion Hersili. So I can be a non-Christian, a non-believer, a non-anything, and look at those three core principles of Christianity and say, those are true. Those are good. You can get them out of Kant. You can get them out of Rawls. You can get them a lot of ways. And so you don't have to be Christian to believe them, but you can say to Christians, this is your religion. Wouldn't it be great if you acted as if it was true?
Okay. Yeah. Yes, you can say to that. And I have to agree 100%. I don't, yeah. There are subtleties of that, but I think we agree with that. But I can cure your mental angst here. I'm going to perform psychotherapy.
Oh, right.
You are not. First of all, one of the things I hate is the claim of loss of faith, as if we're losing something. I claim that losing faith is actually adding things. But I would argue that there's somewhere in your book that you describe yourself as the whole core of your being is to. I love that sentence, and I have it somewhere later on, and I will probably find it about fighting. The things that make you who you are, and we'll find it later on. But that intellectual journey that's made you a person who cares about inequity, who cares about making the world a better place, who cares about these deep things, the wrestling you have with these philosophical arguments, and in a way that I think is deeper and more scholarly than any wrestling I've probably ever done with those things. That's the deep that's a deep satisfaction that those people who are deeply religious, not just superficially religious, have. They wrestle with these moral questions. It leads them in a certain direction, but I would argue that yours is just as real and deep and fulfilling, if not more so, than theirs. I don't think there's anything you're missing. In fact, I would argue quite the opposite. Anyway, that's my opinion. Uh,
Yeah,
um,
I don't know. Maybe you're right. I have no way to know. I mean,
yeah, how do you know?
I've
You know,
had. Are you a parent?
of
Um,
course. Yeah, I'm a parent. Yeah.
and when many parents, hundreds, maybe all of them, tell me, they tell me things like, I'm sorry, this sounds like a digression, maybe it is, but they say things like, until you're a parent, you don't know the depth of love that you're capable of or the depth of anger you're capable of. And when I hear them say that again and again, I start to think, well, that I never have experienced that kind of depth of
Have
love
you
or
ever in
that
an
kind
an
of depth of anger. And my life is fine. Maybe I'd rather not experience those things. I feel no need to be religious. I'm perfectly happy the way I am. Really, Christians out there, I get letters. They say, God is, battering on the door of your heart. Let him in. Can't you see? And I'm perfectly content this way.
well,
It's just
I
the
would
way
argue.
I am. I just
Yeah.
think that I don't perceive or live or have as
Well,
much of these
but
attunements to other aspects of life that you do.
well,
So, bully for
mm,
you.
y well, I mean, well, I would say one is intellectual, one is purely eternal, and I think you can have that in many ways. I don't meditate, but I think when I'm doing physics, it's just the same thing, and so I don't need to go and stare my navel. But, but it's different. A child is an empirical thing, and I would argue the thing you haven't learned if you don't have a child is that you immediately realize all your faults in a way that is so explicit. The minute you have a child is born, you realize very quickly all of your faults. But I think if you and I have a daughter and who I love deeply, but I also have two dogs. I have a dog that I think I can experience the depth of unconditional love with for my dog every much as I can from a human being. I can't communicate as well. Um, Anger, it's not so clear, but, uh but I think you can experience the depths of anger by being married as well. So, um, anyway, I'm alienating much of the audience. So, let's go back.
Not the
Uh,
dog lovers.
yeah, yeah, not the dog lovers. I think, yeah, if you really anyway, it doesn't matter. So, the next point you make, we're still only reviewing we get to the final chapter, which I think is really the ultimate, uh point you're trying to make, and you also say, "What can we do?" Which is always, as you say, what authors fear and audiences hate or something. Um, you say the Christianity is in crisis, but you do point out, and this is a useful bit of sociology, I think, which counters the prevailing wisdom, that the crisis is not the fault of the secular cultural aggression that's happening. The crisis in Christianity is not completely the fault of the secular woke, but is driven primarily by tragic choices made by Christians themselves. Namely, the wall of separation between the private and public values has just appeared, something called the Church of Fear. So I'd like you to elaborate on that because I think it's an important point that does go against popular wisdom and therefore something I love to talk about on these podcasts.
Yeah, so this isn't a huge part of the book, but it's in there because I thought it
It's in,
had to be. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of pages getting involved in the debate over post-liberalism.
yeah, but you
But
do.
okay, so the big word of what we've been talking about is secularization. And secularization is what happens when religions lose their cultural distinctiveness, blend into the background, and has happened to the mainline churches in the last century, become, consumer choices and lifestyles, and people drift away because they're not really getting anything countercultural or different or profound from religion. There is another form of secularization, and this is the path that white evangelical church has been on for really since the 80s, since Falwell and Robertson, but accelerating in the era of Trump, and that's politicization. And that's bringing politics, partisanship, the culture war, and the fear that goes with it into the church. and saying we are here as Christians in order to fight to get our country back. And there's many variants of that theme. And the problem with this is that, as Russell Moore has said, he's a editor of Christianity Today, wrote a wonderful book called Losing Our Religion, formerly identified as evangelical. I'm not sure he still does. When asked why young people are just abandoning the church in droves, he says, if all we're offering them is a choice between paganization and secularization, we shouldn't be surprised if they choose one or the other. So there's this group of people, they're called post-liberals. They tend to be Catholic, though not all of them are. And they claim that you and I are responsible for the decline of religion because our liberal ideology, it's individualistic, consumeristic, utterly personal, anarchic. It's a radical doctrine that mows down faith, family, tradition, and country. And so it's our fault. And I have some stuff to say about that. And I think that's, there is some truth to that. It is hard to be a religion, a countercultural religion in a society with social media and big science, for that matter, small science and secular universities and all of those things. Those are real pressures. I would point out to them that Christianity historically has been at its best when it's a minority faith, when it is an exilic faith, that Jesus was not exactly in control of that society. But I go on to say, okay, I'll grant them that there is a kernel of truth in what they're saying. Nonetheless, the collapse of white evangelical Protestantism in this century is primarily due to tragic choices that have been made by the church itself, and that's to go down the road of politics, especially, not only because it predates MAGA, but especially now MAGA politics.
Particularly
The
politics of us
evangelicals,
versus them. It's not just politics. It's an us versus them politics, a winning and losing, aggressive. Because there are lots of kinds of politics.
yes, exactly.
There's ecumenical politics too. But yeah, it's this
Yes,
church of
thank you.
fear.
That's super important. I call it the church of fear, right? This is
Yeah.
not about whether people engage in politics. Of course, religious people should. It is not about what positions they wind up taking on abortion. You're exactly right. This is about how do people approach politics? In what
Yeah.
spirit do they deal with others? And you mentioned the wall of separation metaphor that I use, which has to do with, okay, the church is pretty good still, white evangelical churches, at doing what they call discipling people, spiritual formation. That's making people in the image of Jesus. In their local church, in their family, in their community, when the hurricane strikes, the churches are just many, many places, just still great. But a wall of separation has gone up between how those folks are behaving in their personal and immediate worlds versus how they're behaving in the civic world. That's the world basically of social media and politics, where they are embracing cruelty, fear, insult. We see this all the time. I've got examples of it in my book. That's the wall of separation, because Christians like Dr. Moore say that Christianity is a unified garment. As David French has put it, you just can't say, I may be a bit of an asshole on Twitter, but you should see me in the soup kitchen.
Yeah.
And so that wall between civic theology and personal theology, that's got to come down. So what these folks are saying is, be Christian in all of your life, including the way you address your fellow citizens on social media and in the political realm.
Okay, well, I mean, that's a good segue. So you talk about the church of fear. And you do point out, as I say, you go against the grain in pointing out it's not the fault of entirely of us secularists, that the church has made many churches have made their own bargain with the devil, and you can choose your devil. And then of course the ultimate, not penultimate, the ultimate part of the book is your thick Christianity, where you basically say, more or less, the summary of it is in a sentence I got from that chapter, which more or less says, because core Christian principles track closely with core liberal principles, They can be brought into alignment and make democracy better. I added that bit at the end, but so that's basically the thesis. Core Christian principles track closely with core liberal principles. I do want to parse that a little because on the surface, sure, yeah, love your neighbor and all the rest, but and fear, don't be in fear, etc. The three things you claim are core Christian principles. I mean, most people, by the way, would would not. Most Christians, many Christians would say core Christian principles. They would say exactly what Francis Collins said to you. His core Christian principle is Jesus was reborn, and another core Christian principle is Mary was a virgin. These are so that the transubstantiation and the virgin birth are probably the two deepest core beliefs without which I don't think you could really call yourself a Christian, because those are the reasons you think that Christ had something to do with the divinity, and yet you haven't mentioned them. And I think it's important to realize that those are just as core principles, and I think those are principles we would both argue have no utility, if anything, negative utility for living in the world. Would you agree with that?
Neither here nor there. The
Yeah.
the
Okay.
principles that concern me and that are defining
The
are the
moral
ones that
principle.
have to do with how we move through the world in relation to others.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and
those
again,
and
I'm not gonna channel Christopher Hitchens to show how the moral teachings of the Old Testament and to some extent the New Testament are, he would argue, abysmal, and he argued pretty that a lot of what Christ said was pretty bad stuff. But I don't want to go there because this, we've belabored that enough. I think I happen to agree with Hitchens, but what I want to ask you is, are those core principles really core principles of Christianity, or core principles of people who use reason to apply it to their Christianity? And the person I'm thinking about is Mr. Oakes, or whatever you call him, President Oakes, or whatever his official name is, the first presidency of the Church of Latter-day Saints. He espouses beautifully in your book principles, as you point out, that are that 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 are Madisonian, as you label them, are completely in accord with the core liberal principles that should govern a liberal democracy. But but I found his arguments not often theological. I found his arguments like those of a lawyer when he started talking about the civic aspect of the church rather than the personal aspect of the church. I found it to be someone who was a person of reason, a lawyer who understands law and society, thinking about to um, how best to apply what he believed to law and society. And I guess I would call that reason, and not so much, not some. I think I'm coming back to this argument that people like him who happen to pick the principles from Christianity that are good, that are liberal, that help, and they come at it from really their education as their secular education. You want to comment on that? I mean, you know Oakes better than I do, but the quotes you give from him strike me as eminently reasonable and eminently reasoned from someone who studied law.
well, that shouldn't be surprising. President Oakes, his title, I believe, is complicated. He's the number 2 person in the church. He will probably soon be the number 1 person in the church. And he is a former University of Chicago law professor, a former justice on the Utah State Supreme Court, a president of Brigham Young University, a man who is deeply steeped in the values and principles of constitutional law. So it should not surprise us that you see those things in his thinking. I think he would be mortified if you did not see those things in his thinking. Where I get off is the locution, he happens to think those things. He is also a profoundly devout Latter-day Saint, deeply steeped in the theology of the religion, and he derives those principles, as I show in the book. This is an important part of the book, work that no one has really done before. He derives those principles from stories that you and I would categorize as myths and interpretations of myths about what happened in the Garden of Eden. And okay, it's
Yeah, no, I'm waiting to jump in. Yeah, go on. I mean, he exactly uses the Garden of Eden, and he
and
and a
so
brilliant. He argues the fall is not a fall; it's a rise. I'm sorry, you should.
yeah, which makes much more sense to me than the Augustinian version. It's
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
yeah, I
Exactly, but
mean,
it's not a
human
Christian version. It's a version of someone who's saying, "You know what?
well,
I'm an academic, and questioning is a good thing, and I'll interpret the Bible the
no,
way I want to."
this is
Okay.
Latter-day Saint doctrine going back to Joseph Smith. He said it's the craziest religion ever. I get off there too because I think Christianity and Judaism are just as crazy. I mean, talking
No, no,
bushes, come
we'll
on.
go into this after. No,
So,
it's based on manifest falsehoods in its scriptures. The other ones are, they're clearly based on miracles
Lawrence,
that happen.
they're all based on manifest
I
falsehoods.
know, but these are empirically provable.
They're
So,
all
talk about
okay.
the
Let's
book
not
of
go there.
the book of
So
Abraham and their thing is based on the burial rites of Ra. Anyway, go on.
so
Yeah.
so look, every faith is complex, and every faith has elements of what you and I would call light and what you and I would call darkness.
Mhm.
And what the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is doing is it has built what I call a civic theology that based on its core principles, going back to the really actually kind of surprising pluralism of Joseph Smith in the 1840s, um, have built a theology about how Jesus would want us to behave in the political realm. And the core ideas are, as President Oakes puts it, patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. Now, as you point out, those are very much in keeping with the constitutional values of Madisonian pluralism. They overlap. That's not entirely surprising because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints considers the Constitution to be a divinely inspired document,
Yeah.
not scriptural, but divinely inspired. So, um, but that church is choosing to elevate those aspects of its faith which align best with our liberal democracy and grounding those in its own theological truth. And I'm not saying that everyone can be a Mormon or should or anything like that. Of course not. I'm not saying Christians should convert and become Latter-day Saints. But I am saying that if Christians look at their scripture, they will have no trouble at all finding in the doctrines as preached by Jesus Christ all the elements for a civic theology which comport very well with what our country needs right now. Pluralism, patience, negotiation, mutual accommodation, getting away from the fear-based politics, getting away from the scorched earth politics, I win, you lose, getting away from the absolutism in which compromise is a four-letter word. These things are disabling our country. So I'm just saying, hey, how about taking inspiration from this church, which is doing this heavy lift of realigning its
Well,
values with those of democracy?
I mean, of course, that's a nice thing to say, but, you could pick I mean, you could I think part of my problem is giving undue respect for that. You could because religions are vague in many ways, and always the scriptures are subject to interpretation, which is good, I guess. Um, you can always interpret them in ways that you've just proclaimed and in which Mr. Oakes and others, from some others in the Mormon Church, I assume he's not universal, but, uh, interpret to take these good points and say, "Let's interpret the scriptures to justify what we already know because we're sensible people is a good thing." But in fact, you're picking and choosing, namely, I think of and I'm sorry, I know I studied the church a lot, its theology a lot, and tried to write about it in the election when Romney was running for president, but the New York Times wouldn't publish it because they didn't want to cause dissent at the time. They didn't want the same thing to happen that's happened in 2000. But a cult, and I think of it as a cult can have some good ideas. But I don't think that necessarily means you need to give it the undue respect. He's clearly a man I respect, his thinking, his interpretation of the scriptures. Um, we won't ask him about his interpretation of the ridiculous aspects of the Mormon Church. But isn't it like saying, and maybe I'm being the devil's advocate, but that's exactly what I like to be. Um, the Isn't it like saying, well, okay, let's say there are flat earthers. They believe the earth is flat. And their theology is the earth is flat, and we have to work together to make sure no one falls off. So we have to respect others, we have to hold in others and not repel them, because otherwise they'll fall off the earth. Well, let's give them respect. I'm sorry, I can't do it.
Well, this may just be a point of disagreement among us, between us.
Yeah.
So we'll see. And you may disagree with my judgment that those three pillars of Christianity that I mentioned, don't be afraid, imitate Jesus, and forgive each other, are, number one, fundamental to Christianity, and number two, substantively important and aligning with democracy. So I am not saying that those are flat earth. And I'm also not saying that they're things I cherry-picked out of the Bible, and that Jesus's ministry is also full of things that could just as easily turn us into the Third Reich. I'm saying if I'm correct, and if Christians who I interviewed, it doesn't matter what I think of Christianity, but if the many Christians who say that these are their core teachings are correct, then this is something important about and central to Christianity, which is true. It's way more than flat earth.
Well,
it's like these are principles which can and do inform our liberal democracy, align with our liberal democracy, and it's not just some coincidence. It's something that I happen to rummage through and find, in some Bible verse.
You didn't happen to. I would argue these people who believe in liberal democracy and who are also define themselves as Christians have worked hard to find a way to reconcile their Christianity with liberal democracy, and they come up with those aspects of Christianity that do. And there's no doubt. I mean, they are three aspects of Christianity, and they but and they are, and they should be the core pillars of our liberal democracy, and we'll be a better country if those people who define themselves as Christians apply those aspects of Christianity to the way they deal with the civic world and the political world. So we're in agreement there. It's a great, if your hope that these
That's the whole
principles,
book right there.
I know,
What are
but
we
your hope
disagreeing
that'll
on?
happen. Yeah, I mean, so I don't disagree that making Christianity kinder and gentler is not a good thing. It's certainly a good thing.
I'd say making it Christian, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I know, but
So
I
what's
think
the
you're giving too
problem?
much. The problem is I think you're giving too much credence to what being Christian is. After all, Mr. Oakes diverges tremendously with 99% of the Christian churches in the world in saying that original sin is not original sin. For many people, original sin is central because Christ died for our original sins. And so I bet, again, I'm not a theologian and I'm sure I'll be attacked for saying this, but I think if you ask most Christians, what did Christ die for? He died because of original sin. The humans had originally sinned, and now he was changing it. Now he was taking up all that sin, and now you could go to heaven just by believing in him, and you weren't tainted by this original sin of your non-existent forebear Adam, or forebears Adam and Eve. Now, Oakes is saying, I disagree with that. I don't think the fall, I don't think eating the apple was an original sin. It was a great thing, and I think that causes him to diverge from 99% of Christians around the world. So I think,
Well,
once
I'll
again,
go
I
you one
think
better, Lawrence. I mean, a lot of Christians think that Latter-day Saints are not Christians. I got in a whole argument with Andrew Sullivan on his podcast about, of course they're not Christian. And there's arguments about, is original sin Is it foundational, or is it something that Augustine brings in? And
Yeah.
I don't get into any of that, and I'm certainly not telling anyone to adopt Latter-day Saint theology. I think it's actually easier to get from core traditional Christian principles to liberal democracy than to get from Latter-day Saint principles to democracy. But my point is just simply, it's what you said earlier. There is more than enough to work with if Christians decide to look into their scripture and say, what elements of this are both core to our religion and core to our democracy? And I think I can say, I'm going to guess you'll go with me on this one because it's not that far out on a limb.
Yes.
I'm going to say that the teachings of Jesus Christ are a great deal closer to the teachings of Madison than they are to MAGA. The Christians I know don't see a lot of Christianity in be maximally fearful, demand retribution against your enemies. Donald Trump Jr. gave
Yeah.
that famous speech where
Yeah,
he
yeah.
said, I understand this business about turn the other
Sure,
cheek,
yeah.
but that hasn't worked.
Yeah, yeah.
Christians, they many of them were, and more of them should be agog at that. That guy died on the cross. That didn't work. What a dummy.
Yeah, well, okay, look, I think it's semantics at some point. I think we agree. I would say if Christians just were more reasonable, that would be better. You claim that you replace the word reasonable for adopting certain aspects of Christianity. And I guess I am not willing to give it so easily a pass. I think that if Christians are more reasonable, um, and I do think a lot of Christianity involves fearing God. I hear it all the time. But
Fearing God,
yeah.
but yeah, not fearing Democrats.
Yeah, I know, but it's one or the other. I mean, God is the ultimate dictator, um, and he'll send you to hell if you don't do what he wants. And he won't even, and unlike Donald Trump, will just kick you out of the country and take your kids away from you. This God will punish you for eternity. Forget that, forget that, if you immigrate illegally, into that religion, you get punished for eternity, and not just. So I'm not so I'm presenting the other view. I think your point is well taken, that once again, we don't disagree fundamentally that since this is a Christian country, if Christians behaved, recognized that their religion was not inconsistent with the cores of Macedonian democracy, it would be better. And moreover, there are elements of Christianity that 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 overlie very well with that viewpoint. And you can take them and discard others, or you can choose to take others and discard them. And I think you're right. The world is a better place if you would do the former rather than the latter.
Yeah, if
But
I could
but
just add something to that goes to what you said earlier.
Mhm.
The benefits of coexisting scientific materialists like me with Christians like Dr. Moore or
Mhm.
David French or Pete Wehner or my other Christian friends, the late Tim Keller, the late Mark McIntosh, they're mutual benefits because, of course, the moderating influence of liberalism, this is small L liberalism of the
Mhm.
founders. That's pluralism and democracy and toleration and human rights and all of that. That's had a profoundly important and I think positive effect on Christianity. These things need each other. And the
Yeah.
problem is when they get out of alignment, when they're going in opposite directions, when millions of Christians are interpreting their religion as requiring retribution, political maximalism, never compromise, drink drink liberal tears. When
Mhm.
they're doing that, that's going to put a huge strain on the country. These things have got to be closer together.
Oh, look, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, I want to point out that obviously we agree in spirit. We agree in many things. I, I guess the concern I have is the undue respect that's being given for Christianity and religion, um, which I don't think it necessarily deserves. And it's not just, yeah,
Yeah,
religion in
I
general.
take the point, and it's where I was 20 years ago, and it's not
Yeah, I told
necessarily
you.
wrong.
I
The
told you I'm the
change,
guy.
that's the guy. Yeah, well, I'm arguing with myself. The change in me has come from knowing the people that I've mentioned and others, the pastors that I've become friends with,
Mhm.
non-Christians, rabbis that I've become friends with have have given me more respect than I've started out with, and helped me to understand that the great old religions, the ones that have been around for a long time, if you believe in moral evolution, you might expect that the ideas which survive and thrive over 2 to 3,000 years will be better than the ideas on average that pop up yesterday, the moral ideas. And I've come to think that that's true. That's a change
Wow.
for me.
Yeah, because
I
I think
think you don't think that.
yeah, I think the more we learn about the world, the better we are to interpret and the ideas that come out. We know a lot more now than we did 100 years ago, and that's why you can get married to your husband, and I'm happy about that. And I've argued that it's science that's led that way, and
Oh, well,
rather than
yes, of course.
homosexuals, that would have happened in ancient times. And so I think
Of course,
I
you're talking to a gay person, but in terms
I know,
of
but
ethics
but
and
that's ethics.
morality, there's stuff there in those traditions that is profound and important and that we can draw on and should respect. I was on another podcast who's also where I was, 20 years ago, and said, "Isn't in your book, aren't you really just throwing in the towel on the idea of a true secular society that doesn't need any of this mumbo jumbo?" And I thought about it and I said, "Yeah, I guess I am throwing in the towel on that. I guess I'm saying that that's not something that's attainable or even really desirable."
Well, I hope we're going deeper than that, but I think that, um, look, the point is that there's lots to choose from. There's beauty in the Psalms. I mean, look, anytime you read people who may or may not have thought deeply about the world, you get something out of it. And so it's not as if the Bible is to be discarded or religious I mean, and you're absolutely right. I think the worst the example of how not to think about this was the stupid proposal that atheists call themselves brights that was made in around the 2000 to suggest
I
that religious
forgot
people
about
were the
that.
stupids. Yeah, and that's idiotic. And I have to say that having spent 30 or 40 years, maybe less time, but in the public arena talking about this, I've certainly evolved because I think I was patronizing and felt like, oh yeah, I'm smarter than you. And I've learned with age, if nothing else, to get that many people have wisdom and they get it from different places. Um, and I know many wonderful people who are religious. I know many wonderful people who aren't, and I'm always intrigued about where they get that from. One of the reasons I run the podcast is to find the origins of people I admire or whose ideas I think are important. But I don't. But I think it's misplaced to. I think I admire the people and where they get their ideas from more than the religious dogma that they may have grown that may have contributed to their getting it. I think that's my
Well,
point.
I take the point. A place where I disagreed with the late Mr. Hitchens is that I think that people make religion stupid rather than the other way around.
Um, uh, well, yeah, okay, interesting. It comes into what we defines by religion, but there's no doubt that people that that yeah, people make
We're
religion stupid. People make secularism stupid too.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
was about to say,
eh,
we're good at importing stupidity into
yeah,
a lot of the
yeah.
things that
And the
we
great
do.
thing about science, which you talk about so beautifully in your books, by the way, and we've talked about before, is that it's not that scientists aren't stupid because they are. It's that the science has a mechanism to overcome the scientists. That's why science is better than religion because it has the mechanism to overcome the nonsense. Religion, unfortunately, doesn't. You need people like you to say, "Hey, smarten up." But science doesn't have to say that because the process eventually leads us to the right or at least better answers, even though the scientists themselves may not be there. I want to go into two or three things more, and then and we're on number 10, by the way, of 30. But I've skipped a few, of course. But I keep look, maybe because the only intelligent thing I ever heard Kissinger say was something he stole from someone else, which was the reason academic disputes are so vicious is because the stakes are so low. And he didn't invent that, but it's true. And maybe that's the reason I'm picking. We agree so much that I'm picking at our differences, but I think it allows us to have some interesting conversations. But and it's that religion, it's that difference of sort of giving an innate respect to religion, which I guess I can't get to. I can give innate respect to religious people, but I can't give innate respect for religion. But uh, uh, but you talk a lot about the Respect for Marriage Act, which of course is obviously something that is near and dear to you for personal reasons as well as intellectual ones. And you talk about how it was an act of compromise, how the Latter-day Saints supported it as a compromise. They didn't buy homosexuality as moral, but they realized as a civic compromise, allowing for the belief that people should be able to choose how they behave is central to their view of their Christianity, and therefore that was central to to the Respect for Marriage Act is really a respect for people to choose how they behave and whether they're damned or not, and ultimately, but they say you quoted a sentence which really grated on me. Um, that the traditional and religious views of marriage, which have to be accepted, so you can't force a cake maker, who's deeply Christian for one reason or another and believes homosexuality is an abomination. You shouldn't have to be able to force that person to make a cake to celebrate your marriage, Jonathan. But the statement is that the traditional religious views of marriage are, quote, based on decent and honorable religious and philosophical premises. It's assumed that religious premises are decent and honorable. Those same preferences were used to justify racism. Those same decent and honorable religious views argued that certain people were inferior. I mean, the question of what is decent and honorable, I would argue, is not to be decided within the religion, but within the domain of reason and civic discourse. So I think automatically saying decent and honorable religious views. For example, what if I created a new religion and got rich doing it, um, based on racism? Would that be decent and honorable? If I said, I've had a revelation, that, whatever, you pick your favorite group I want to pick on, doesn't have to be blacks, make it Jews, I don't care. Um, that they are evil and not human. Um, and ultimately, if that religion took off and it had enough people adhering to it, that'd be tax exempt. Um, I think you and I would argue that that's never decent and honorable. And to give it to treat it that way because it's religion is unfair to religions and is unfair to people.
Well, I could get in trouble here by forgetting what I wrote in my own book, and you may have it in front of you, but I think I was making a narrower point there, which is that their views specifically about marriage, not everything in the religion. Of course, everything in these religions isn't decent and honorable. Um, I mean, who would defend that proposition? But I
No, no,
think I was saying,
but I guess you were saying that, but my point is a little different. It's that it's reasonable, it's honorable not because it's religious, but it's honorable because it's sensible. Because those same religions say many things about marriage which you would find not honorable, like a woman is supposed to obey a man. And so I don't I get once again I try to ask, how does one know what's honorable and decent in religions? Well, the way you know it is by applying reason and logic and
yeah.
common sense.
So I think that the religious objections to same-sex marriage were not, in fact, in the same category as their objections to, for example, interracial marriage, that the latter had no basis in theology and no basis in virtue or morality and were simply imported racism into the religion.
What
Um,
what about what about women as what about the Catholic view of women as priests?
um, I'm against it. It's their religion, but I want
You
to get
don't
to
you think it's
marriage because
fundamental?
well,
As fundamental as the belief of marriage?
so
That marriage is
let
between a
me
man and a
first
woman?
talk about
Okay.
marriage because that's the
Okay.
subject I know.
Okay.
So what I think I'm doing there is making a narrower point that there are deep reasons in theology and in the view of human sexuality that pertains in all religions going back 3,000 years,
Mm-hmm.
which made same-sex marriage seem illogical, impossible, or worse for them. And I think in some cases, probably many cases, people who objected to same-sex marriage were acting out of animus against homosexual people. But I also think that in those religious traditions, there are deep teachings that go back way before modern science about homosexuality and marriage and sexual orientation and all that, about, God created men and women and complementarity of the sexes and the purpose of sex and all of those things. And what I'm saying is that those were not invented as an excuse to hate on gay people, and that it was possible for people to believe those things and to be against same-sex marriage on that basis. And that I met many of those people. As you know, the big crusade of my life, campaign, I should say,
Yeah.
was same-sex marriage, a cause that I never thought we would win, but that preoccupied me for 20 years. And in the course of that, I met more than my share of people who had dishonorable motives, but I also met Christians who said things like, how about civil unions? I
Mm-hmm.
can't get all the way to marriage because the Bible says this and that and so forth. But how about just calling it something else? And those were people really working hard to try to make room in society for people like me and my husband. I said, no, that's
Yeah.
not good enough. And I gave the reasons. But the point I'm making there is we should not assume that everyone who opposes us on a
Oh,
policy is acting on the basis of animus, or
oh
that the
no.
religion itself is necessarily framed as animus. So that's the only point I'm making. And
Oh,
as to whether
I
women
can.
should be priests in Catholicism, I don't know. I mean, if I wrote Catholicism, it would be, but, you know,
I guess my point is, it's not to suggest malice on the part of people who are against same-sex marriage. Quite the contrary. I'm arguing that the religious tenets themselves, which I think you've argued very clearly, counter to a point you made earlier, that ancient wisdom isn't so wise, because ancient wisdom was made by, Stone Age peasants who didn't know the earth went around the sun, and they certainly didn't know about human sexuality.
oh,
So
yeah, well, of
that
course.
ancient
Yeah.
wisdom, the wisdom of
Look,
3,000 years is the fact that it survived 3,000 years doesn't make it good. It just makes it
yeah, of
based on.
course. Of course. I mean,
Yeah, so no, but I
yeah,
mean, I
that's
think you
that's
argued earlier
that's in
that
the
somehow
category
things
of,
that have survived 3,000 years are necessarily deep. Sometimes they're just wrong, and they survive because we keep promoting that, and
people can believe things that turn out to be wrong for reasons that are decent and honorable.
exactly. Yes, that's
And
right, and
if they can give reasons for why they're wrong, which I can argue with and which may be empirically wrong, but which are grounded in their own best efforts to figure out what's true, I'm not gonna condemn them. I'll say, "I
no,
think
no.
you're wrong," and I'll explain why.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah. I guess, yeah, I'm not
decent and
suggest
honorable doesn't mean factually true. No, of course not. I mean,
and I'm not suggesting people believe them aren't decent and honorable. I'm suggesting the ideas are not inherently not decent and honorable, and you and I can argue why. They're ideas that decent, honorable people
yeah, okay, I'll
adopt.
accept that.
Okay.
I'll accept that. I think that's right. And I said all the time,
Yeah.
to good people, good Christian people, for that matter, non-Christian people who
Mm.
oppose same-sex
Yeah,
marriage, that I
yes.
had respect for them, but that I thought that their belief was wrong and cruel, um, and I said all those things.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
eventually they heard
Okay. So
a
I
lot
think,
of them, not all
okay.
of them.
Okay. My big problem is that we just too often our society assume because it's something from an organized religion that it has to be decent and honorable, and it doesn't. And as I say, decent and honorable people believe it, and Steve Weinberg, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and I've misquoted him many times. He's died now, but he said gave a quote which I love the most. He said, you know, "There are good people and there are bad people. Good people do good things. Bad people do bad things. When good people do bad things, it's religion." And and in any case, Okay, we agree. I have 3 questions that are much more specific as we head to the end here. One is a quote from you, where you said, "I've heard sermons that have left me feeling far closer to truth," or something like that. Um, could you elaborate on that? What did you hear that didn't come from your deep and I know from having talked to you, your deep philosophical ruminations about the world. So is it can you give me an example?
Yeah, there's a pastor I know. His name's Chris Davis. He's the pastor at Groveton Baptist Church in Alexandria.
Mhm.
And he is a deeply educated man in the ways of the Bible and a very cultivated man. And he gives a mean sermon. And it's several years ago, so I won't remember the details. But he was able to take a passage in the Bible, which I hadn't particularly thought about, which didn't seem especially interesting, and begin to unpack implications of it and put it in context of other things in and outside the Bible. And doing the work of exegesis, which he was able in the course of his, sermon, which was, I don't know, half an hour or whatever, to turn 2 or 3 or 4 corners so that I left the room thinking, "Wow, that's something I never thought about." That's an insight, whether it's about the meaning of that portion of the Bible or an insight into how to live. And that's not because he's Christian, it's just
Yeah.
because he's a good thinker.
Oh, hey, I could have said that. That's exactly my point. Is that you don't is that the good thinking is the important part. And it's nice if they're Christian and it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter to me one way or another. It's good thinking that matters. And I think
I guess maybe where we disagree is on, or at least have a different emphasis, is on the extent to which there is good and valuable stuff in these scriptures, these texts, on which to disagree. Or if we should just treat them as a pile of words that are kind of
Mm. No,
superstitious.
no, no, no. I think the point is like I told you, any deep, as in such a book, there are going to be nuggets of wisdom, and deep thinkers will take those nuggets and discard the others, and that's what I think you're asking the Christians to do, ultimately, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
I guess I'm asking secular people for a bit more, and this is where we fight each other a little bit, which is I'm enough of a Burkean and a believer in moral evolution to think that if something's been around a very long time and respected by huge numbers of people, many of whom are smarter than I am, that it deserves a kind of deference which would not be the case for something that popped up yesterday.
Oh, see, okay, yeah, I think because 'cause I'm a
You don't
scientist.
go there, yeah.
Well, because I'm a scientist, I've learned that Aristotle it was a long time, but, you just needed Galileo and poof, it's over. And all these I love the fact that ideas that humans have carried with them for thousands of years are shown in a instant to be wrong. That's what makes science so good. So I guess,
Well, not all that often, though. Science is
no, no, no,
conservative, right?
no, no, it's very conservative. Of course, I'm not saying everyone's Galileo, but the fact that respect, I think I didn't say it. I don't know whether it was Bronowski or someone else, but somehow that science basically led us away from the wisdom of ancient books to the wisdom, of experiment. And I think, and I really, and and I love ancient books. So don't get me wrong. I love, but, I think that drives me as much as anything else. I think taking us away from the wisdom of ancient books is a huge progress for humanity. And science does it because if you're a scientist, if you're Richard Feynman, you don't or Newton was deeply religious, so he isn't a good example. But if you're Richard Feynman, you can just derive it all yourself, and you don't need the ancient books. You don't even need the physics books. And that's wonderful. Anyway, so
It's not
so
not quite consistent with the conservatism of science, which in principle does give a lot of deference to ideas that have survived
the test of
decades,
time,
or in the case
test
of
of experiment.
evolution, over a century of testing.
No,
We
it's
don't start from scratch in science every day. We couldn't.
no, no. We give deference to the ideas which have survived the test of experiment. That's it. Think and evolution has survived the test of experiment for 200 years, and that's why we give it deference. Similarly, Newton's laws have survived the test of experiment. If they didn't, we would throw, even if they were Newton's, and tomorrow we discovered they were wrong, we would throw them out like yesterday's newspaper, and we should be prepared to do that, even if we have revered them for centuries.
As Charles Sanders Peirce says, we should be willing to throw out whole wagon loads if they're proved
Yeah,
wrong.
that's from your earlier
So
books. Yeah.
I don't defer to anybody's Bible on the material universe. I don't think it's true that there was a Noachian flood and the entire world was covered with water, and that's why we have dinosaur fossils on the top of mountains. Um, where I make a distinction is in moral propositions.
Yeah, you defer to the Bible and moral propositions, and I don't. That's
I
probably
mean,
one
I
of our
don't defer unquestionably. I hope that's clear. I mean, look,
yeah,
I'm
you
gay and I'm married, right?
yeah. But yeah,
But
no,
I
I guess
do
my
yes, I do say, it's like the famous line about if you buy a property and you find a fence on it, don't tear it down until you know why it's there. I do give
yeah.
it that kind of deference.
Okay, good, and I would agree with that. I guess my point is that I don't, I don't defer to them on morals. I ask the questions, and if the
And as
morality is
good
reasonable,
Jews, our
that
rabbis would
yeah,
say,
but
"Damn
that
right
does
you ask the questions."
yeah,
That's
yeah, and
every
that's why it's
generation
not
should.
Christian. Yeah, okay, and I differ on what I think is fundamentally Christian, but how you say to a bunch of other things, 2 other I wanna pick some quotes that really hit me, and then I wanna ask you one last question. And again, you realize I would not be doing this if I didn't admire your thinking so much. Um, you said, how might the" I'm gonna read it because I wrote it's a quote that was too long for me to write in my little book here. Um, um, how might the country I mean, I was blown away with this, how, oh, yeah. How might the country be different, I wonder, if more students from secular backgrounds were exposed to comparative religion courses, which respectfully examined the Bible and its sources alongside other religious traditions? Well, I can't argue with that. I, the reason I can't argue with it is that it's history. And I think when you learn history, you always, gain wisdom. I love history. Um, I guess I might say, however, w- that that's nice to say, but wouldn't isn't the opposite even better? Wouldn't it how if I were to put it, how might the country be different if more students of religion were taught about science? I think that would be so much better. Comment?
Do I have to choose? And
What?
can I add how much better the country would be if all students were taught civics?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess.
Yeah, you can't teach everything. In that
No,
passage I make
but I guess because you're talking religion here, you pick it out. But I think if I had to pick, look, I think comparative religion courses are fine. But if I had to choose, it's fine. I like to people learn everything. I wanted to learn everything. It's just always, I still want to learn everything. But again, giving special respect to religious traditions, I think, is being unduly kind. Okay, let me but there's one statement you made which really hit me. How much better informed how much better informed might news coverage and other media products be if religious perspectives were reliably sought out and knowledgeably covered? I found that to be, of all the statements, more of an affront because the religion is why, news is how, and I guess I mean I wish, again, once again, that if news, more routinely, uh, uh, um, uh, um, included, where I forget where it is now, but, if news coverage regularly sought out scientific perspectives, it would be great. Um, but I just don't see that where how could the news be more informed and, if if religious, perspective, how much better informed might news coverage be? Why do you pick religious cover I mean, if if the perspectives of religious people who were committing acts might be explored, that's one thing, but in the news, I think the religion shouldn't play any role at all, and I'm surprised you say it.
I'm surprised you're surprised. So American newsrooms are very secular, have
Right.
undercovered religion for many years, or relegated it to what used to be called the religion page back when newspapers were still, a thing. And I think that led to a blind spot in, for example, covering the rise of MAGA, Donald Trump, all of that. People looked around one day and said, what the heck just happened here? And part of that is that I think a lot of religious people pick up a newspaper and don't see themselves in it, don't see their world in it. So it's just journalism 101. It's saying this is a very important subject to a lot of people in this country, and our coverage has been lazy and second rate. We just need to do more of it. It's important.
Well,
So,
I agree with you there. I
it's a
guess I
statement
just
about
think journalism.
journalism.
Well, I mean, journalism on the whole, unfortunately, in my mind, has largely become, I hate to say it, lazy and second rate, and I don't think it's done the job it should have. And I'm sad to say, I've interacted with a lot of journalists and I've respected numbers, but I think maybe the
Are they
24-hour news,
lazy and second rate?
not the ones that are lazy. No, the ones that aren't lazy and second rate. I just think the 24-hour news coverage that's turned journalism into lazy and second rate. When it didn't
We
give
could have a
people the
whole
time.
show on the
Yeah,
crisis in journalism. It
yeah,
keeps
yeah,
me up
and
every night.
yeah,
It's
it
just
does. I think the
terrible.
crisis in journalism is as responsible as almost anything else for many, because I respect and need the media and journalism to preserve a healthy democracy, and I get so disappointed at the shortfalls. But yeah, I see your point taken. I guess I've seen endless stories about religious right and MAGA, but they're probably all superficial in the same way that they superficially cover other things too, perhaps. But okay, I guess I understand your point there then. Um, if they sought out why, it's like trying to, although I didn't like J.D. Vance's book, and I was one of the few people who didn't, I didn't like him when I read it. I thought it was self-aggrandizing, but I think the point was, if we understood more of the people from, Appalachia, then we would understand Trump more. And the same is probably true for understanding where MAGA comes from. Um, um, let's end. We've gone 2 hours, and I wanna just end on two more things. I love talking to you. In case it wasn't obvious, I don't know if the public's gonna
It's
care.
it's it's
Good.
mutual.
Okay. Um, this book was notably written before Donald Trump was reelected, and
Yes, it was.
I found it missing tremendously
Yes,
because
it is.
because it talked about, the Trump of 2020 and not the Trump of 2024, and the fact that he really did win that election with not necessarily a mandate and not with a majority, but close, but certainly much more so than before. And I wanted to ask you to comment on how you might change or how it might add to anything you said, reflecting on what's happened in the last week or two, even since he's taken office.
Well, that's probably a very different conversation because I don't know when this podcast will air, but as I say these words, we're about, I guess, about 2 weeks in, and we're already into what looks like it might be the beginning of a kind of post-constitutional era.
Hmm.
It's in many ways a worst case scenario, but we're not here to talk about that, right? So how would
No,
the
but
book have been
I bet
different?
I did not so much what he's done, but the fact that he was elected. I mean, you talk about the evolution of MAGA and 2020 as if it was a thing, and
So
then I think in the book I'm coming to seeing hope that he wouldn't win when
so
I
the most important thing in the election happened actually before the book was completely closed, so I did know about it, and that's not the general election outcome, which is what it is.
yeah.
Um, but there were 2 things. There's one very important thing that we knew in probably April, May of
Mhm.
2024, and that's that he would get the Republican nomination with the overwhelming support of white evangelicals, and he would get that despite the presence in the race of other candidates, notably Rick DeSantis,
Mhm.
who were, how can I say this, people of better character and people who were, if anything, even more reliable on the issues that conservative white evangelicals care about. And what we discovered is what we always knew, which is they're not voting for Trump despite his flaws, reluctantly wishing that someone who was a little bit more in keeping with their values would be elected. They vote for Trump because they love his message. When he talks about retribution, when he talks about fear, when he says, as he often did, if you vote for me, you will have power. These profoundly unchristian, or at least unchrist-like messages, they love it. In 2024, we knew this would happen. They voted 80+% for him, as they had in previous elections. So we already knew that they were affirmatively choosing this particular type of politics and politician, even in the face of alternatives. I don't think we
Yeah.
quite knew
Okay.
this then, but we
You know,
know it now, that he would basically become a kind of pro-choicer, that he would take the position on abortion that Democrats like Mario Cuomo took, which is let the states decide. We had been told by those conservatives and anti-abortion pro-lifers that abortion's murder. If you really believe abortion's murder, you probably want a federal law outlawing it. You probably don't want to say, well, some states will have murder and other states
yeah.
won't have murder. And Trump says, okay, I'm against a federal statute. We're going to let the states murder babies. That's a position that prior to Trump, I think would have been firmly rejected. But because it came out of Trump's mouth, it wasn't rejected. So, Lawrence, what I take away from all that is what was in the book, but even more so. There has been a real joining, a real coupling of white evangelical Protestantism and the MAGA movement in ways that have become, how can we say this, problematic.
And your
Maybe
goal
not the
is to,
best word, but
yeah, no, and your goal is to try and improve that. And I think that's the whole point, that this book is basically saying it doesn't have to be that way. And if you can make it happen, if your words, which I, may disagree with in principle, but if your words, some of your words, I agree with most of them, but if your words can make it happen by saying, hey, to be Christian doesn't mean you have to be MAGA, then you're, as my late friend Steve Weinberg would say, you're doing God's work. He's also an atheist. But let me end with two quotes from you, because I think one, I finally found the quote. It's on the second last page of before you do your last letter. You say, injustice is only visible from society's margin, and doing what I can to contend against it has been my life's greatest privilege. And it is, and that's what you're doing now. And we're all luckier and more thankful that you have been doing it. It's a privilege for us that your life's privilege has been to try and fight injustice by logic and reason, which is I ultimately think is the best way, and not God. But you also say, I do believe there's faith, and I do believe there's hope. And without a hope, there's nothing. There's a rapid decline. We can choose to have hope to make faith work. That's clearly what guides you, and I'm glad that you have hope. And I hope that your hope wins out. It has been a true honor and pleasure to be able to talk to you about the book.
Lawrence, the honor and pleasure are mine.
Well, thank you again for being back here again. And it is as you can tell from my reading of it, and my notes, it's a thought-provoking book for anyone, as not surprising. And as I say, the goal that we need to fix our democracy, and to the extent that Christianity is a problem, we need to fix that, is something that I don't think anyone could argue with. And let's hope from your mouth to God's ears. Thank you again. Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at origins project.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture.